She didn't cry when she found out. She didn't scream. She didn't throw anything across the room or collapse against the wall the way women do in movies when the truth finally arrives. She didn't do any of those things. She just sat there in the quiet of a Tuesday morning in Mississippi, in the kitchen she had kept for 31 years, at the table she had wiped down 10,000 times, with a cup of coffee going cold between her palms and the slow, unbearable weight of understanding settling over her like a change in weather. Like something that had been moving toward her for a long time and had finally, without ceremony, arrived. And what you need to know about Margaret Ellen Calhoun, before any of the rest of this story makes sense, is that she had spent the better part of 6 decades being the kind of woman who asked for very little, who gave quietly and completely, who stayed when staying was hard and loved when loving cost her something, and never once stood in the middle of a room and demanded to be seen. She had built her life the way her mother had taught her to build things, carefully, patiently, with both hands and a steady heart. And the moment she understood, sitting in that kitchen with the morning light coming through the curtains and the birds carrying on outside like nothing in the world had changed, the moment she understood that the life she had been so carefully building had been built on something that wasn't solid, that was the moment everything inside her, very quietly, and without any noise at all, changed forever. Margaret grew up in a small house on the outskirts of Hattiesburg, Mississippi, in a neighborhood where the lots were wide and the oak trees were old, and the summers pressed down on everything like a warm, heavy hand that didn't mean any harm. It was the kind of place where people left their screen doors unlocked until 10 o'clock at night, and where the smell of someone else's supper would drift across 3 yards and remind you that you were never entirely alone in the world. Her father worked at a paper mill. Her mother kept the house and kept the children and kept, with enormous quiet effort, the whole fabric of their daily life from coming apart at the seams. There were 4 children in the family. Margaret was the second, the middle daughter in the way that middle daughters so often are, unassuming and steady and relied upon without anyone ever quite saying so out loud. She was the one who remembered things, who remembered the permission slips and the dentist appointments and the names of her younger brother's teachers and the anniversary of the day their grandmother had passed. She was the one who showed up. Not because anyone had asked her to, not because she wanted the recognition, she genuinely did not, but because somewhere very early in her life she had absorbed a simple and unshakable truth, that love is not a feeling you declare on special occasions. It is a practice, it is what you do on the ordinary Tuesday. It is the coffee you make before anyone else is awake, and the permission slip you sign without being reminded, and the phone call you make to the relative no one else wants to call. Margaret had learned this by watching her mother, and she had carried it forward the way women carry the things they learn from their mothers, not consciously, not as a rule, but in the body, in the habit, in the reflex of the hands. She met Dennis Calhoun at a church social when she was 22 years old. He was standing near the sweet tea table with 2 of his friends, laughing at something, and the laugh was the first thing she noticed, full and easy and unself-conscious, the laugh of a man who took up space in a room without apology. He was broad-shouldered and square-jawed, and he had a way of looking directly at whoever he was talking to that made you feel, for the duration of that attention, like the most important person in the building. He asked her to dance that evening. She said yes. By the end of the night, he had learned the names of all 4 of her siblings, the name of her mother's rose garden variety, and the name of the teacher who had most influenced her in school, and he had remembered all of them and asked follow-up questions about each one. She drove home that night thinking that she had never in her life met a man who listened like that. They were married 2 years later in the summer, in the same church where they had met, on a June afternoon so humid that the flowers in her bouquet had begun to soften before she reached the end of the aisle. She wore her mother's earrings. Her father cried at the reception and tried to pretend he hadn't. Dennis's mother told Margaret she was the best thing that had ever happened to her son, and Margaret had believed her. And in that moment, standing in a pale yellow dress in the fellowship hall with the ceiling fans turning slowly overhead, she had felt something she could only describe as complete, like a long, important sentence that had finally found its period. The early years were good in the way that early years often are, not perfect, not without friction, but genuinely warm. They rented a small house on the east side of town and filled it slowly, the way young couples do, 1 yard sale lamp and 1 hand-me-down bookshelf at a time. Dennis worked in insurance. Margaret taught 2nd grade at an elementary school 12 minutes from their house, and she loved it with the specific, bone-deep love of a person who has found the work they were meant to do. She loved the small, serious faces of 7-year-olds learning to read. She loved the smell of crayon and chalk dust and the particular chaos of 20 children all trying to say something important at the same time. She brought that same quality of attention to her classroom that she brought to everything: full presence, real patience, the kind of care that children can feel even when they can't name it. Their son Thomas was born 3 years into the marriage. Their daughter Renee arrived 2 years after that. The house they had rented became too small, and they bought the house on Camellia Drive, a white-framed house with a deep front porch and a backyard large enough for a vegetable garden and a swing set, and eventually a trampoline that the children used for 4 years and Margaret kept for 10 more because she could never quite bring herself to dismantle it. That house became the whole geography of her life. She knew every creak in its floors and every draft in its hallways and every mood its rooms took on depending on the season. She painted the kitchen herself 3 times over the years, changing the color each time as the children grew and the house changed around her. She planted roses along the back fence, pink first, then white, then a deep coral that Dennis had always said was too bright for the yard. She planted them anyway, and they grew spectacularly. Dennis moved up at the insurance company. He began traveling more for work, not constantly, but regularly, a pattern of overnight trips and long Fridays and occasional full-week absences that Margaret adjusted to without complaint, because adjusting without complaint was, she understood, part of what the life they had built required. She managed the house and the children and her classroom. She attended school events alone and explained Dennis's absence to teachers and coaches and other parents with the practiced ease of a woman who has explained the same absence many times and learned to make it sound like less than it was. She did not resent him for this. Or rather, she told herself she did not resent him for this, and for a long time the two things felt like the same thing. Thomas grew up and moved to Tennessee. Renee moved down to Biloxi. The swing set came down. The trampoline was eventually, quietly disassembled and donated. The house on Camellia Drive, which had once been full of the noise and velocity of a growing family, settled into a different kind of life, one that was quieter and slower, and organized around the rhythms of 2 people who had been living alongside each other for so long that their habits had become the furniture of the place, permanent and barely noticed. Margaret retired from teaching at 56 with a card signed by the entire staff and a small crystal apple on her desk that she kept on the windowsill in the kitchen where the light hit it in the afternoon. She told herself that retirement would give her and Dennis more time together, that they would travel, perhaps, that the empty nest and the open calendar would feel like an invitation. It did not feel like an invitation. It felt, if she was honest, and Margaret was always honest, at least with herself, like standing in a room she had decorated beautifully for a party that no one was coming to. Dennis was still working, still traveling, still coming home with the distracted energy of a man whose mind was mostly somewhere else. The dinners were quieter, the evenings were longer, she took on more at church. She started a small kitchen garden in the backyard and devoted herself to it with more focus than was strictly necessary, because the garden was something that responded to attention, something that grew when you cared for it. She noticed, without dwelling on it, that her husband had stopped responding to attention in quite the same way. She could not have pointed to a single moment when things changed. That is the thing about the slow erosion of a marriage. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a confrontation or a confession or a door slamming in the night. It arrives in the accumulation of small things. The way he stopped looking up from his phone when she walked into a room. The way he answered questions she hadn't asked, filling in silence with noise, but went quiet when she asked something real. The way he used to reach across the table to touch her hand, and then one day simp. Life stopped, and she couldn't remember exactly when the last time had been, and that was somehow the saddest part of all. She told herself it was the age they were at. She told herself that long marriages had seasons. She had seen enough of life to know that passion settles into something quieter, and that quieter did not have to mean lesser. She held on to that. She held on to it with both hands, the way you hold on to something when part of you already knows it might not hold. The phone had been on the kitchen counter because he had left it there while he went out to the garage. This detail matters, the pure ordinariness of it. He had not been careless. He had simply been momentarily distracted, the way people are in their own homes, the way people are in the places they feel most safe. Margaret had been in the kitchen making a grocery list, and her own phone was on the charger in the bedroom, and she had reached for his without thinking because it was closer and she only wanted to check whether the rain they were expecting would arrive before or after she needed to go out. She picked it up. The screen lit. And there in the notification preview was a message from a name she had never seen before, a woman's name, 2 words, ordinary enough, and the message itself was short. 12 words, maybe 15. She read it in less than 3 seconds, but in those 3 seconds she understood everything. She put the phone back exactly as she had found it. She did not open the message. She did not scroll through the thread. She did not stand there shaking or go to the bathroom to be sick or do any of the things a person might expect. She went to the window and she looked out at the backyard, at her rose bushes coming into their second bloom of the season, at the bird feeder her granddaughter had painted last Easter, at the old oak tree at the back of the property that Dennis had been saying for 4 years he was going to get trimmed. She looked at all of it for a long time, and then she made herself breathe, all the way in, all the way out. The way her mother had taught her when she was a small girl who cried too easily, who felt things too quickly. Breathe, Margaret, just breathe first and think after. She made the grocery list. She went to the store. She bought everything on the list plus a pot of basil for the windowsill because it was on sale and she had been meaning to get one. She came home, put the groceries away, started a pot of soup for dinner, and said nothing. She was not making a decision in that silence. She was not yet at the part of the story where decisions get made. She was in the part that comes before, the part where you have to let the thing you've just learned become real to you, where you have to let it settle into your body and your understanding, where you have to sit with it long enough to see it clearly instead of reacting to the first terrible shape of it. That evening she watched Dennis closely in a way she had not watched him in years, not with suspicion, not with anger, with attention, with the cold, lucid attention of a woman who is seeing something she previously looked past. She watched the way he held his phone, angled slightly away from her when a notification came through. She watched the way he laughed a little too easily when she came into the living room, filling the air with cheerfulness that didn't quite connect to anything. She watched the way he said her name, Margaret, when he wanted her to pass something at dinner, and said nothing at all the rest of the time, the name a tool and not an address. She had been looking at this man for 31 years and she had been seeing something that no longer matched what was here. She understood this now. The understanding was quiet and cold and absolute. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the dark and listened to Dennis breathing beside her with the steady ease of a man who felt no particular weight on his chest, and she thought about her mother, who had once told her that the hardest thing a woman ever has to do is tell herself the truth about the life she is living. Her mother had said this when Margaret was perhaps 30, during a conversation that had seemed abstract at the time, theoretical, the way mothers sometimes say things to their daughters before the daughters understand what they are being prepared for. Margaret had nodded and moved on and filed it away somewhere, and now, lying in the dark at 59 years old, she finally understood what her mother had meant. The truth was not the hardest part. The truth, once you allowed yourself to see it, was almost a relief. The hardest part was everything that came after. The next morning, before Dennis was awake, she went to the kitchen and she picked up his phone. He had not changed the passcode, 4 digits, their son's birthday, a code she had known for years and had never used until now. She opened the message thread. She read enough. She didn't read Ev. Everything she didn't need to, and some part of her understood that there was a limit to how much truth she could absorb in a single morning in her own kitchen. But she read enough to know that this was not new, that it had been going on for a long time, that the woman's name belonged to someone in a city 2 hours away, that the language in those messages was the language of familiarity, of ease, of two people who had long since moved past the beginning of something and arrived at a middle. She read enough to understand that she had not imagined the distance of the last several years, had not invented it, had not caused it. She had simply been on the other side of it without knowing what was on this side. She took photographs of the screen, careful, clear photographs of several exchanges, enough to constitute a record of what she was seeing. She did it without drama and without particular feeling, or at least without feeling she allowed herself to name. Then she put the phone back on the nightstand where it had been, went back to the kitchen and made coffee. When Dennis came downstairs 40 minutes later, she handed him a cup and asked if he wanted eggs, and he said yes, and she made them. They sat at the kitchen table where they had sat 10,000 mornings and talked about the weather and the neighbor's new truck and a thing he had seen on the news. And Margaret listened to all of it with a face that gave nothing away and a mind that was somewhere else entirely, somewhere clear and cold and purposeful, making a list of everything she needed to do. Over the days that followed, she paid attention to the finances in a way she had not done in years. This was her own failing, and she acknowledged it without cruelty to herself. She had trusted Dennis to manage their money because he had always presented himself as capable, and because she had been busy with other things, and because trust in a marriage sometimes looks like delegation, and she had not known she was delegating to a man who did not deserve it. She found the filing cabinet in the study and she went through it methodically. Bank statements going back 3 years, the retirement account documents, the mortgage papers, a life insurance policy she had signed and never read. She made copies of everything, every page, and put them in a folder she kept in the trunk of her car. She did not yet know exactly what she was building toward. But she had spent enough of her life being the woman who showed up and managed things to know that information was not something you gathered after you needed it. You gathered it before. You gathered it quietly and carefully and without announcing what you were doing, and then, when the time came, you had it. It was on a Saturday afternoon that her daughter Renee came up from Biloxi. She had come ostensibly to help with the yard. The hedges along the front needed trimming, and Margaret had mentioned it in passing on the phone, and Renee had offered, and Margaret had accepted in the ordinary way without reading anything more into it. They worked in the yard for 2 hours, easy and companionable, the way mothers and daughters work together when they have always been close, talking about small things and comfortable silences in equal measure. It was not until they were sitting on the back porch in the late afternoon with glasses of iced tea sweating in their hands that Renee looked at her mother, stopped what she was saying mid-sentence and just looked and said quietly, "Mama, something is wrong with you, and I don't mean physically." "What is going on?" Margaret looked at her daughter. Renee was 34 years old with her father's coloring and her mother's eyes, and a directness that Margaret had always found equal parts exhausting and deeply comforting. She looked at her daughter and she felt, for the first time since the Tuesday morning in the kitchen, the precise location of how tired she was. Not sleepy tired, tired in the bones, tired in the way that comes from holding something heavy for too long alone. She told Renee a portion of what she knew. Not everything, not the photographs on her phone, not the folder in the trunk of the car, not the full weight of what she had read in those messages, but enough, the notification she had seen. The distance of the last several years and the way it now had a name and a shape and a city 2 hours away. She told it plainly, without performance, without the trembling, dramatic confession she might have once imagined delivering in a moment like this. She just said the words. And when she was done, she looked at her hands around the glass and waited. What Renee said was not what she expected. She did not get angry. She did not say she had always suspected something, did not fill the air with noise and reaction the way the moment seemed to invite. She sat quietly for a moment. Then she reached across the small porch table and covered her mother's hand with her own, a gesture so simple and so complete that something in Margaret's chest cracked open along a line she hadn't known was there. "Whatever you decide," Renee said, "I am not going anywhere. Whatever you need to do, I will be here for every single step of it. You are not doing this alone." And that was the thing that broke her open, not the betrayal, not the messages, not the years of distance or the slow, quiet erasure. That one sentence from her daughter on the back porch in the late afternoon, with the light going gold through the oak trees, that was the thing that finally made Margaret Ellen Calhoun cry. She cried for a long time, and Renee held her hand, and neither of them said anything, and the birds went on in the yard, and the sun went on moving, and the world did not stop, which was both the saddest thing and somehow also a kind of comfort. Margaret called a lawyer on a Monday morning. She had gotten the name from a woman at her church, a quiet, practical woman named Dolores who had been through her own version of this story 8 years ago, and who had pressed the lawyer's card into Margaret's hand one Sunday after service with a look that asked no questions and required no explanation. The lawyer's name was Patricia Hendricks, and she was a small, composed woman of about 50 with reading glasses on a beaded chain and an office that smelled like coffee and old wood and serious, careful work. Margaret sat across from her and laid out what she knew, and Patricia listened with the focused, unhurried attention of a person for whom none of this was shocking and all of it mattered. When Margaret was done, Patricia looked at her over those reading glasses and said, "You have done more of the right things already than most women who walk through that door." And Margaret felt something settle in her, not triumph, not relief exactly, but the particular steadiness of a person who has been moving in the right direction, even when the direction felt uncertain. The confrontation itself, when it came, was not what movies have trained us to expect of such moments. There was no raised voice, no breaking of dishes, no door slamming hard enough to shake the walls. It happened on a Sunday evening in October, the windows open because the heat had finally broken and the air coming through the curtains carried the particular smell of autumn beginning its work. The dishes were done. The television was off. Dennis was sitting in the living room with his phone, and Margaret came in and sat down in the chair across from him. Her chair, the one she had always sat in, the one she had reupholstered herself 2 years ago in a pale blue fabric she loved. And she looked at him steadily and she said, "I need you to put the phone down and look at me." Something in her voice, the quality of it, the absence of any of the usual accommodating softness, made him look up immediately. He put the phone on the arm of the sofa and he looked at her, and she could see in his face the first small shadow of something that was not quite alarm yet but was moving in that direction. She told him what she knew. She did not accuse. She did not use words like cheat or betrayal because she found in the moment that the plain facts were more than sufficient and more than devastating, and she did not need to amplify them. She told him what she had seen on the phone that Wednesday morning in the kitchen. She told him she had gone back the following morning and read more. She told him she understood clearly what it was and how long it had been going on and approximately what shape it had taken. She told him all of this in a measured, even voice, looking at him without blinking, and when she finished, she folded her hands in her lap and waited. Dennis did not say anything for a moment. Then he reached for his phone, and he began to delete. She watched him do it, watched his thumb moving across the screen with a kind of deliberate efficiency, opening the messages, clearing them, moving to the next thing. He was not panicked. He was not frantic. He was methodical. He was doing what a certain kind of man does when cornered, not confronting the problem, but erasing the evidence of it, operating on the assumption that if the proof disappears, then the argument disappears with it, that a woman's certainty is only as solid as the documents that support it. He deleted messages. He deleted a contact. He deleted photographs she had not known existed. He did all of this with his jaw set and his eyes down, and when he was finished, he placed the phone face down on the cushion beside him and looked at her with an expression she had seen before on his face, the expression of a man who has just managed a situation and expects credit for the management of it. "There's nothing there," he said. "You misread whatever you saw. You were tired, Margaret. You've been under a lot of stress and you read something that wasn't what you thought it was." She looked at him for a moment. She let the silence sit between them like a third person in the room. "I took photographs," she said, "the Thursday morning after I first saw it, before you were awake. I have them on my phone, and I have printed copies in a folder with the financial documents I also copied, which are in my car." The expression on his face changed. It moved through several things quickly: surprise, calculation, something that was trying to become anger and couldn't quite get there because anger requires a position of strength, and he had just understood that he was not standing in one. What it settled into finally was a kind of deflation, a going out, like a room when all the air leaves it at once. She watched it happen and she felt nothing she had expected to feel, not triumph, not grief. Not even the release she might have anticipated. She felt more than anything extraordinarily tired, and beneath the tiredness, very deep, like the first distant sound of water after a long dry season, the faint beginning of something she would later understand was relief. What followed was not clean or simple or resolved in the way that stories resolve. Dennis did not confess completely that evening. He offered a version of things that acknowledged some and minimized the rest, the way people do when they have been caught and are still managing their exposure rather than actually reckoning with what they have done. Margaret did not push him. She had what she needed and she knew it, and she did not need his confession to validate what she already knew to be true. She told him that she had spoken to a lawyer. She told him that she intended to proceed calmly and practically, and that she hoped he would do the same, for the sake of their children and their grandchildren and the 31 years they had shared and the portion of that time that had been genuinely real. She stood up then from her pale blue chair, and she said good night, and she went to the bedroom, and she slept, not easily, not deeply, but she slept, which surprised her, and in the morning when she woke up she made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and watched the yard come into the light, and she thought, "I am still here. I am still exactly here." The months that followed were hard in the ways she had expected and hard in ways she had not. There were legal appointments that were long and detailed and exhausting and necessary. There were phone calls with Thomas in Tennessee that were careful and painful and full of the particular awkwardness of a grown child trying to hold space for a parent's grief while processing his own. There were evenings when she sat in the living room alone with the lamp on and the old house settling around her in its familiar way, and felt the full, unguarded weight of what 31 years meant, not as a number but as a life, as a collection of ordinary days and meals and small kindnesses and shared silences and moments she had taken to be evidence of something real. She let herself feel the grief of those things. She did not rush it, did not package it, did not perform a recovery she hadn't yet arrived at. She cried when she needed to. She sat still when sitting still was what was required. She called Renee every evening at 7, and Renee always answered always. She also did practical things. She opened her own bank account, her own, solely under her name alone, something she had not had since before the marriage. She met with Patricia Hendricks 4 more times and came away from each meeting with a clearer picture of what she was entitled to, which was more than Dennis had perhaps anticipated, and which Patricia delivered in her quiet, composed way as simple fact. She had a dinner with Dolores from church, the woman who had given her the lawyer's card, and they talked for 3 hours over pot roast and sweet potato pie, and Margaret came home feeling, for the first time in a long time, like a woman with allies. She went to the nursery south of town on a Wednesday afternoon, and she bought 4 new rose bushes in a deep, vivid coral, the exact shade Dennis had always said was too bright for the yard, and she planted them along the back fence where the afternoon light was best, and stood back and looked at them for a long time with dirt on her hands and something unclenching slowly in her chest. Dennis moved out on a December morning, gray and cold, with the kind of flat Mississippi winter light that makes everything look a little more final than it is. He took what was agreed upon and left what was agreed upon, and Margaret stood on the front porch and watched the truck pull out of the driveway, and then she went back inside and closed the door and stood in the hallway of the house that was hers now, fully and completely, and she breathed. All the way in, all the way out, her mother's way. She did not celebrate, she did not feel victorious. She felt what she would spend a long time trying to describe accurately to Renee, a kind of enormous, unfamiliar space. Houseness, like a room with all the furniture rearranged and the windows opened for the first time in years. Strange and disorienting and full, underneath the strangeness of genuine, unobstructed air. Thomas came to visit in January, and they spent 4 days together, cooking and watching old movies and talking in the easy and honest way that she and her son had always been able to talk. And on the last morning over breakfast, he looked at her across the table and said, "You look different, Mama." She asked him what he meant. He thought about it for a moment, and then he said, "You look like yourself." She didn't fully understand what he meant until after he had gone, and she was washing the dishes in the quiet kitchen and caught a glimpse of her own reflection in the dark window above the sink, and recognized, without quite expecting to, the face looking back at her. Spring came the way it always comes in Mississippi, suddenly, emphatically, with the azaleas going all at once and the air turning from cool to warm almost overnight, and the whole world deciding in the span of about 2 weeks to be alive again. Margaret's granddaughter, Lily, Renee's youngest, 6 years old and deeply serious about the business of being 6, began coming on Saturday mornings. They would have breakfast together and then go out to the garden, and Lily would ask questions about every plant she encountered with the focused intensity of a child who expects complete answers, and Margaret would explain each thing carefully and completely, the names and the needs and the way each growing thing had its own particular requirements that had to be understood and respected if you wanted it to flourish. She noticed, teaching this to a 6-year-old, how much she knew. How much she had accumulated quietly over the years without ever quite accounting for it as knowledge. She started going to a Thursday evening gathering at her church, not a prayer group exactly, more like a circle of women, mostly her age, who met to talk about things real and difficult and sometimes funny, who had between them a collective understanding of what it meant to have lived a long life and arrived, sometimes by painful routes, at something truer than where they had started. She had avoided this group for years, vaguely, the way she had vaguely avoided anything that felt like it was admitting more than she wanted to admit. Now she went every week and sat in the circle and listened and occasionally spoke and felt, in that room, the specific comfort of being understood without having to explain yourself from the beginning. She called her lawyer one morning in April to ask about something in the settlement documents, and Patricia, after answering her question, paused for a moment and said, "I want to tell you something, Margaret. I've been doing this work for 20 years, and there are not very many women who walk through this with the kind of dignity and clarity you've shown. I hope you know that." Margaret thanked her. She hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the curtains she had chosen herself and the coral roses visible through the window, already budding in the spring warmth, and she held Patricia's words in her hands for a moment, not to save them as a trophy but simply to acknowledge them, to let them in. By the time the first anniversary of that Tuesday morning in the kitchen had come and gone, Margaret Ellen Calhoun was living a life that was smaller than the one she had imagined for herself at 24, standing in a pale yellow dress at her own wedding reception, and larger in every way that mattered than the one she had been living for the last decade of her marriage. Her house was hers. Her mornings were hers. Her garden was producing abundantly that summer tomatoes and cucumbers and 3 kinds of basil and the coral roses, blazing and spectacular along the back fence, exactly as vivid as she had always known they could be. Lily came on Saturdays. Renee called at 7. Thomas visited in the summers and sometimes at Thanksgiving, and always called on her birthday, which was more than he had managed when Dennis had been in the picture, as though Dennis's absence had created a space the children had quietly moved into. She was not yet sure she would describe herself as happy. Happiness felt like too simple a word for the complicated, textured, hard-won thing she had arrived at. What she felt was more like clarity, more like the particular piece of a woman who has walked through something that was meant to diminish her and found on the other side of it that she was not smaller, that she was, in fact, more fully herself than she had been in longer than she could clearly remember. She felt grounded. She felt honest. She felt in the early mornings when she took her coffee out to the back porch and sat in the garden light with the birds starting up in the oak tree and the dew still on the grass and the whole of a day stretching out in front of her, unhurried, unpoliced, entirely her own. She felt something she recognized from her childhood, from the girl she had been before she had learned to make herself smaller to fit alongside someone else. She felt free, not the loud, declared freedom of a dramatic escape. The quiet, earned, deeply personal freedom of a woman who has told herself the truth and survived it and decided to build something real on that foundation. She tended her roses in the mornings and her kitchen garden in the evenings. She sat in her pale blue chair and read the books she had been meaning to read for years. She drove out to see Renee in Biloxi once a month and came home with her granddaughter's drawings stuck to the refrigerator with magnets she had been collecting for 30 years. She went to the Thursday circle at church and spoke honestly when she had something honest to say. She did not pretend that the last year had been easy. She did not pretend that she had always known who Dennis was or that she bore no responsibility for the years she had spent not seeing what she might have seen sooner. She was too old and had done too much real living to comfort herself with a version of the story in which she had been entirely without fault. But she also understood, finally, clearly, without the softening that guilt sometimes asks for, that there are things a faithful woman can do that do not protect her from the unfaithfulness of the person she is being faithful to. She understood this not as bitterness but as fact, as information, as something she was going to carry forward with her eyes open. What she wanted when she tried to say it plainly even just to herself was not extraordinary. She wanted mornings like this one. She wanted her granddaughter's hand in hers in the garden on a Saturday. She wanted the Thursday circle and the phone calls with Renee and the drive down to Biloxi with the windows down and something good on the radio. She wanted the coral roses to keep coming back every spring, which they would, because she had planted them in good soil and given them what they needed, and things that are planted in good soil and given what they need have a way of returning. She knew this. She had always known this. It was the oldest thing she knew. She sat on the back porch one evening in late May with the last of the light moving through the oak tree and a cup of tea cooling in her hands, and she thought about the woman she had been on that Tuesday morning in the kitchen. The woman sitting very still with the coffee going cold and the weight of a new truth settling over her. She thought about her with tenderness and with compassion and with something that was close to pride, not because that woman had handled everything perfectly, but because she had breathed. Had gathered herself, had not shattered, had taken the information she was given and slowly and painfully and over many months built something honest out of it, had chosen, again and again, the harder and truer path over the easier and lesser one, had stayed not in the marriage but in herself, had come through. The birds were loud in the oak tree, the roses were perfect along the fence, the yard was hers, the evening was hers, the quiet was hers, and Margaret Ellen Calhoun set down her cup and looked out over the garden she had planted with her own hands in the soil of her own life, and she felt fully, plainly, without apology, at home.